Now I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Jens Andermann, who is a professor of Spanish and Portuguese at New York University and an editor of the Journal of Latin American Cultural Studies. He is the author of Tierras en Trance, Arte y Naturaleza Después del Pasaje, which should be coming out this week or next week or sometime very soon in Santiago, Chile. New Argentine Cinema, 2011, The Optic of the State, Visuality and Power in Argentina and Brazil, from 2007, and Mapas de Poder, Una Arqueología Literaria del Espacio Literario, in 2000, as well as edited collections on environmental aesthetics in the present, memory in the museum in Latin American post-dictatorships, contemporary Latin American cinemas, and on exhibitions and material cultures in Latin America. His work has also appeared in Memory Studies, Cinema Journal, Arqueología, Revista Iberoamericana, Journal of Material Culture, and Theory, Culture and Society, among others. His talk today, The Animal Alliance, Living and Dying in the Extractive Zone, will dialogue with some of the topics that have been discussed earlier this month at both the Global Studies Conference and last week with Hector Rojas' presentation. So it's my honor to introduce Jens.
Thank you. I'll stay here because I have a few quotes later on, and from here I can manipulate the PowerPoint. Thank you very much, Krista, for the invitation. I was just saying it's such a luxury in New York. We never get full rooms like this because, we're rivaled by 30 other events taking place at the same time. This is, other than Hector Rojas' talk last week, which is probably more work in progress, this is stuff that is part of the book, which is or is not out in Chile. They told me last week, the week before, the next week it's going to be there, but I haven't seen it yet. It's a book called Tierras en Trance, Entranced Earth, and the subtitle is something like Art and Nature After Landscape. It's a book that's probably trying to do too much at the same time, but the main hypothesis, I guess, would be that the way we've been engaging with the non-human environment through the medium of the technology of landscape has become exhausted in the course of the 20th century, at the same time as new forms of material inscription, embodiment, investment have emerged across the arts, but especially, I guess, in performance and visual arts. For me, the challenge of that book was to bring into one and the same piece of work the idea of exhaustion, crisis, and emergence. And this part, which is probably the most literary of all of them, it's part of the chapter that works sort of as the where I turn the switch from exhaustion to emergence. Well, I'll leave it there and just try to read the paper so as not to lose too much time. I'll start with a few more urgent and contemporary references. On January 26, 2018, so just over 2 months ago, Marcinho Matos, a prominent local activist for the movement of landless peasants, was murdered at his home in the Boa Sorte settlement in the state of Bahia, in front of his family, yet another victim of the high-intensity war that's being waged all across Latin America against indigenous, Afro-descendant and peasant communities. I was writing this sort of a week before the assassination of Marielle Franco in Rio de Janeiro, which has brought home the urgency of what I'm talking about here. My other example, and really the list could go on, Temístocles Machado, a leader of the Afro-descendant community of Isla de la Paz, Colombia, was shot by motorized assassins, again in front of his home. I'm not go on through the examples, but there's another one which at the time I found very striking, but it has become kind of less exceptional in the context of present-day Brazil, the killing of the environmental secretary of a small town in Pará, in the Amazon, who had been a very vocal opponent of the Belo Monte hydroelectric dam project, and was quite probably killed because of this. What all this and many other recent acts of violence seem to have in common then is not only their shared setting on the advancing frontier of transnational resource extraction, but also the obscenely graphic character of this violence. Not a violence that does not make the slightest effort to conceal itself, but actually exhibits. It's obscenely graphic. It seems to make a point of acting in the open, of so to speak, displaying its all-powerfulness, and the consequent all-powerlessness of not just those who are its direct victims, but also the so-called public sphere, including ourselves as we talk of this here. It's a power that seems to say all the time, we don't care, you can't stop us in any way. So what I wish to call the extractive zone, following the title of Macarena Gómez Barris' recent book, encompasses, and I quote her, encompasses the colonial paradigm, worldview, and technologies that mark out regions of high biodiversity in order to reduce life to capitalist resource conversion. That's Macarena, but it also, I think, includes the culture of terror on which an intensified extraction and conversion of living matter into surplus must necessarily draw. And here I'm thinking, of course, of Foucault's argument that the right to kill in the context of a liberal or neoliberal governmentality by necessity must draw on the racialization of some sort of other. And that's also the argument that Macarena Gómez Barris makes in relation to the escalation of state terror, I think there's no other way to call it, against indigenous populations from Chile to Central America. So race and gender are key elements of neo-fascist racial capitalist discourse that, she says, violently reorganizes territories as well as continually perpetuates dramatic social and economic inequalities that delimit indigenous sovereignties. As Michael Tausig has argued a long time ago already, referring to the Putumayo rubber boom of the late 19th and early 20th century in the border region between Peru, Ecuador, and Brazil, this culture of terror sets in motion an imaginary of cruelty that blurs distinctions between life and death, between the real and the imagined. He kind of traces the emergence of a certain form of magical realism to this culture of terror. He says, what distinguishes cultures of terror is that the epistemological, ontological, and otherwise purely philosophical problem of reality and illusion, certainty and doubt becomes infinitely more than a merely philosophical problem. It becomes a high-powered tool for domination and a principal medium of political practice. And in the Putumayo rubber boom, this medium of epistemic and ontological murk was most keenly figured and objectified as the space of death. So that's what's it called? Colonialism, shamanism, and the wild man. So indeed, current anti-indigenous moral panics, as drawn up in mass media all across Latin America in order to buttress extractivism's right to kill, have a long history in Latin American modernity. It is, I would suggest, in the literary movement known as regionalismo, regionalism, where this longue durée of the extractive zone and its racialized biopolitics come into view most forcefully, as well as a counter-movement that rallies human and non-human elements to combat extractivism to advance, so that biopolitics not of extraction and conversion, but of contagion, of mutation, and of emergent community. In a story written in the early 1920s, El Simoun, and Simoun is some sort of desert storm, I'll come to that later, Horacio Quiroga, Uruguayan Argentinian writer, stages as a narrative duel between two hostile environments, the jungle versus the desert, the trope of a natural insurgency against an advancing colonial capitalist modernity. In Quiroga's story, the struggle in which eventually the desert prevails over the jungle as the most hellish of all environments that reject the traveler's intrusion. In this struggle in which the desert manifests itself, the struggle, manifests itself through a rift inside the narrative voice. There's the first narrator and protagonist is being challenged here at the remotest point of his journey by another voice that wrests narrative authority away from him to never return it. The first narrator, a young urbanite who, much to his distaste, has to work as an inspector of meteorological stations for the Ministry of Agriculture, refers his journey up the Paraná River until he reaches the border with Brazil, and there meets the Frenchman Briand, the local station master of a logging company, station master of the Climate Observatory, and also manager of a logging company, with whom he has to stay for an extended period of time due to torrential rains. And eventually monotony, too much booze and so forth provoke a nervous breakdown in this young inspector, to which Briand, taking away the story from this first narrator, responds by telling him of his own sufferings when he was a military official with the French region in the Sahara, and where the sandstorms, hence the Simoun, the heat and so forth, had destroyed a long-standing friendship with a fellow soldier. So both stories are really one and the same, different only in the intensity with which an aggressive nature hurls itself at each of the protagonists, and in the way in which each protagonist, as narrator, transmits this border experience in language. So I think El Simoun could also be read as an early and perhaps meta-literary reflection on a series of dystopian travelogues written over the first half of the 20th century, especially concerning relations between body, voice, and environment. A series of environmental insurgencies, the violent eruptions of which correspond to this rift inside narrative discourse itself. A rift which frequently takes the form of a confrontation between voice and writing. And here I suggest a mode of formal reflexiveness emerges on the relation between literature, as of course also a technology of modernity, and the sequence of environmental crises resulting from the colonial extractive insertion of frontier spaces into global capitalist circuits. And the natural environments that acquire, I always put natural here into inverted commas, but I don't want to do this all the time, so just imagine them. The natural environments that acquire in many of these texts an agency of their own to exert their violence not just on the protagonist, but also on the mode of representation commanded to their capture, correspond to a surprising degree to Latin America's modern and even colonial eco-history. The jungle stories on the one hand and the desert stories on the other, between which, so to speak, the environmental geography of regionalism extends, if read in succession, tell the story of what two eco-historians, Brailovsky and Fogelman, call the sequence deforestation, depopulation. deforestation leading to soil erosion and consequently to rural exodus in many parts of Central and South America between late 19th and late 20th century. So we can think of this literature, the narrative dynamic of which often consists in a journey, either this journey of the cosmopolitan urban subject into the heart of darkness, and into, very often not the jungle, the forest, or the inverse movement of the retirante, of the rural exilee who flees, no? A rural environment beset by drought, flooding, and so forth. We can think of this literature, I think, as a kind of modern counter-narrative which confronts its often urban audiences with images of the reverse of progress and civilization as experienced in the cosmopolitan city. Interesting to note that literature was often ahead of science when it came to registering this fatal sequence between deforestation and rural exodus. In a poem called Achadores, Lumberjacks, in Sol Alto, 1932, the Argentine playwright, sociologist, poet Bernardo Canal Feijó points to the tragic cycle of extraction that forces the jornaleros, the day laborers of the Argentine Northwest, to destroy the very foundations of their own subsistence. The rhythm of the hatches provides here a measure of a funerary dance in which the instrument subjects to its destructive frenzy both the forest and the very body that wields it. These are just, working translations. I'm going to read the original in Spanish. El ritmo de las hachas es la cabal medida de un destino. Baila, baila pues. Las hachas percuten en el propio corazón del mundo y es un compás de danza viril y vengativa, y las recias columnas de los cielos nativos se derrumban y en cada caída se abren nuevas pausas al alma. Tac, tac, un día te hallarás súbitamente solo, con la última jornada se habrá ido tu paisaje, y el abra de aquel día será ya tu destierro. I'm not so much interested in the poetic qualities here as in this split in the subject, no? That, as Canal observes, leads to a very radical form of alienation. No? A subject forced to become the agent of destruction of his own living environment for the benefit, of course, of foreign capitals, which brings to an extreme, forces to an extreme, and thus ultimately breaks down the man versus nature dichotomy on which the extractive machine of capitalism is itself founded. For paradoxically, the day laborers who, in the logging camps of Canal's native Santiago del Estero in the north of Argentina, just as in the rubber stations of the Putumayo, have to reduce the forest ecosystem to exportable primary resources, are also themselves reduced to a dehumanized, vegetative existence that confounds them with their victims, as Clemente Silva, the old rubber tapper, who is a kind of Virgil for the narrator, Arturo Cova, in La Vorágine, one of the main texts of the so-called novel of the rainforest, by José Espacio Rivera, as Clemente Silva exclaims, mientras le ciño al tronco goteante del tallo acanalado del caraná para que corra hacia la cazuela su llanto trágico, la nube de mosquitos que lo defiende chupa mi sangre y el vaho de los bosques me nubla los ojos. Así el árbol y yo con tormento vario somos lacrimatorios ante la muerte y nos combatiremos hasta sucumbir. And I want to read this alongside Giorgio Agamben's well-known observation that, I quote, the division of life into vegetal and relational, organic and animal and human, passes first of all as a mobile border within living man. End quote. I think it's on this mobile border that passes through living man at the same time as it's a geographical border that literary regionalism constructs its voice, its enunciation. Nature on this limit, which also is of course the extractive zone, which corresponds to this advancing frontier of capitalist expansion, rebels first and foremost against its own naturalization. By this I mean that the most dangerous aspect of its insurgency, of its aggression in these stories, is not the way it hurls its forces against the intruder, but the semiotic character these forces acquire in the process. So it's their biopolitical and thus their argumentative character in which nature effectively contradicts the objectifying discourse that aims to exclude it from the semiotic realm, because in its objectness it cannot communicate, it cannot speak back. By contrast, in Latin American regionalism's narratives of environmental uprising, nature speaks in insurgent tongues because the very same anthropological machine, Agamben's term again, that sets apart the human from other forms of the living, also throws outward, throws towards the extractive zone a realm of intermingling and sympoiesis, as Donna Haraway calls it, where processes of interspecies symbiosis become possible, if not necessary. In the stories of environmental uprising, this speech of natural forces that contradicts the foreign discourse of the intruders is different from animal and vegetable speech in fables. It does not figure in emblematic non-human bodies the values and qualities that still are proper to the human, but rather in making talk a non-human universe that becomes a political agent in its own right. These narratives anticipate the Anthropocene hypothesis recently redeployed by Dipesh Chakrabarty, say, in a text that many of you will know, regarding the collapsing onto a single plane of human history and natural history, and the concurrent need, he says, to put global histories of capital in conversation with the species history of humans. So nature in Latin American regionalism's narratives of environmental uprising rises up against the very border traced in order to separate it from the human. A border that traverses, as we've seen, human life itself at the same time as, historically, geographically speaking, it comprises capitalism's mobile zone of extraction. The jungle, in another story by Quiroga that perhaps best sums up this historical crossroads of struggles, El Regreso de Anaconda, the return of Anaconda, the jungle rose up ardently in a single voice, says the text, but it does so only once it has been subjected in its entirety, the whole jungle, to an extractive regime that required this externalized nature, that drew on this nature as its repository, its reservoir. As a son of trans-species alliances, the jungle rises up here, activating the political nature which the forces of the forest acquire precisely once they have been separated from the human polis. In the words of the great serpent of Anaconda, todos somos iguales pero juntos. We're all the same, but only together. Todos somos iguales. Do I have the quote there? Yeah. Pero juntos. Cada uno de nosotros de por sí no vale gran cosa. Aliados somos toda la zona tropical. Lancémosla contra el hombre, hermanos. Echemos por el río nuestra zona entera con sus lluvias, su fauna, sus fiebres y sus víboras. Lancemos el bosque por el río hasta cegarlo. This story has been read very often as a kind of allegory of anarchist, trade unionist mobilization. But as I think is very clear, the alliance it sketches out goes far beyond this, precisely because it includes workers in its horizontal assemblage of living forms, but also this assemblage comprises molecular climatic processes. It's a much wider alliance that's at stake here. An alternative biopolitics, we might say, a biopotencia which, from a communitarian exterior, mobilizes the counter forces emerging precisely from their shared exclusion on behalf of the immunitary apparatuses of biopower. I'm of course using Roberto Esposito's terminology here. The returns of Anaconda, and by this I mean a series of rewritings of one and the same narrative nucleus by Quiroga, from Un drama en la selva, a drama in the jungle, published in 1918, to El regreso de Anaconda, first published in 1925. The returns of Anaconda evince the gradual consolidation in Quiroga's work of a figure of animal alliance which sees the emergence of an oppositional, of a resistant biopolitics based on the community of the living. I'm going to try to shorten this a little bit. What's interesting is that in the first version of the story, Un drama en la selva, the message had been very much the opposite, because here the split occurs not between the human and the animal universe, but within the community of serpents. The venomous serpents start fighting the non-venomous ones. And what's interesting is that the hero of the story is still not Anaconda, but Musurana. And I want to quickly go into this change of ophidic species. Anaconda, the largest of American boas, belongs to a family of non-venomous serpents whose diet includes fish, mammals, reptiles, and birds, whereas the Musurana is the largest of the ophiophagic snakes, that is, snakes that eat other snakes. Although her fangs contain venom, it isn't dangerous for humans, whom the Musurana therefore rarely attacks, but by contrast it can be lethal for some of its victims. Not generally, the Musurana bites other snakes to kind of anesthetize them, and then strangles and kills them by constriction. At the same time, the Musurana is immune to the venom of the adders on which it feeds. So it's indeed a kind of natural ally of the scientists looking for the serum to immunize humans and domestic animals against the venom of the wild adders from the forest. In a detailed genetic study of the successive versions of Anaconda, the story that opens, that's the kind of second iteration, from the same volume of short stories from which El Simoun or where it's included. Napoleon Bacino Ponce de Leon shows how Quiroga, while maintaining the ambiguity of the first version's juxtaposition of two axes of conflict, humans versus animals and vipers or snakes versus adders, gradually moves to some key elements of the final sequel, El regreso de Anaconda, in the first instance because Anaconda, unlike Musurana in the second version of the story, is no longer the enemy of the other snakes. At the vipers, there's an assembly, a congress of vipers in the first two versions of the story, where in the first version, the target of the lucha a muerte, the struggle to the death against the humans, is the defense of la familia entera, the family of the snake, whereas in the second version it becomes la selva entera, the whole forest. So there's a move towards what I want to think of with Esposito as the selvatic comunitas, the community of the living rather than the species, the individual species, constructing a kind of immunitary shield, be it the human species or be it certain kinds of snakes. I'm trying to gloss over this. What's interesting is that in the first version of the story, Brahma en la selva, finally Musurana, this sort of natural ally of the scientists, is adopted by the scientists. It's the only snake left alive and becomes kind of the pet of the scientists, because she's so good at, they say, combating pests, combatir pestes. So you're either a pest or a pet. Those are your two possibilities in the logic of immunitas. Right? I quote Esposito, who says, if communitas is that relation which, in binding its members to an obligation of reciprocal donation, jeopardizes individual identity, immunitas is the condition of dispensation from such an obligation, and therefore the defense against the expropriating features of communitas. Now, El Regreso de Anaconda, the return of Anaconda, narrates a story radically different from this previous version, and its fable of construction and crisis of immunitary alliances. Here, from the very outset, the narrative voice is placed outside human historical time and space, adopting instead a language of myth. Cuando Anaconda, en complicidad con los elementos nativos del trópico, meditó y planeó la reconquista del río, when Anaconda, in complicity with the native elements of the tropics, meditated on reconquering the river. Here we're in a temporality that differs radically from the historical chronotype introduced in a subsequent story of that same book, the title giving Los Desterrados, the displaced, the first paragraph of which introduces various types representative of the frontier region that will protagonize the book's subsequent episodes. On frontier types. Yet the temporality of El Regreso de Anaconda is not a time that is prior to that of the texts that follow. It's not a prehistoric or a foundational time, because in fact it is rigorously contemporary in that here and there what is being narrated are the conflicts stirred up by capitalist frontier expansion into the forest, to the extractive zone. The difference between the two narrative temporalities has to be understood rather as representing a time that has still not separated from space as an autonomous dimension. The story of frontier expansion is the same here as in the subsequent stories, but it is narrated from a multiplicity of living experiences, animal as well as vegetal, living experiences of space-time which all converge on the great river. The time in El Regreso de Anaconda is first and foremost the movement of the waters in their abundance or scarcity. It's the meteorological and hydrographic time of the currents of the Paraguay and Paraná rivers through which Anaconda and her accomplices traveled. And that's, I think, why Anaconda, who's after all a river serpent, is also the protagonist, because it is to her that all the different interventions from animals, plants, climatic events are addressed, in a sense, as she is floating with the current of the river. This mythical community that surges in response to Anaconda's call to break down the immunitary alliance of the story's preceding versions, nevertheless retains from these the ecumenical vocation attributed to the great serpent. Despite having triggered the union of the forest's sombría fraternidad, ravaged by drought and infected by their intruders and their domestic animals, by convincing all the beasts to hurl themselves against man, who has been, says the story, is and will be the cruelest enemy of the forest. Despite all this, Anaconda once again takes under her wing against the protests of the adders and the tigers and so forth, a human being, the agonizing mensu, or day laborer, she finds floating inside his hut on an islet. That is, she reopens the communitarian alliance towards the very element against which it came into being, albeit with a crucial difference with regard to the previous stories, because instead of the biologists of Un Drama in la Selva, instead of the benign colonizers, so to speak, we now have a native human being reduced to a condition of extreme abandonment. Here I have a little discussion I won't go into with Jennifer French, who's written a fantastic book on, among others, Quiroga and, if you like, a lineage of colonial storytelling that comes down from Kipling and others. And she says, well, the Mensu sort of enters the alliance because his relation to the environment is sort of more sustainable, so to speak. You know? I think that's not at all the case, because the Mensu is, after all, a day laborer for the logging company. He's part of the, it's the very Mensu that Kanal talked about in the forest, who is actively destroying his own source of subsistence. And that's why he is found agonizing in the throes of death. So it's the shared victimization by the extractive apparatus that draws the Mensu into the alliance, the comunitas. I'm looking for the quote here. Es un pobre individuo como todos nosotros. He's a poor individual, just as all the others, is what Anaconda says, justifying why she won't kill the Mensu. So, reconfiguration of alliances, or of the comunitas, of poor lives, of lives stripped of their community of origin, of their environment, which, with the replacement of the scientists by the proletarianized peasant, traces from this condition of deterritorialization shared by the labor force and the living forms on which it is being deployed. I quote Gabriel Giorgi here, a minor biopolitics, an alternative community in which these bodies crossed by lines of variation trace alternative modes of commonality. I want to go, I hope, briefly into a last aspect of this commonality among damaged, impoverished lives here. And I want to start this by a comparison between two quotes, which are remarkably similar, and which speak to the way in which the extractive song is a song of emergency, una zona de emergencia, which more nicely allows you to speak of emergency as in catastrophe and emergence at the same time. This is the first one from Vidas Secas by Graciliano Ramos. O mulungo do bebedouro cobria-se de arrebações. Mau sinal, provavelmente o sertão ia pegar fogo. Vinham em bandos, arranchando-se nas árvores da beira do rio, descansavam, bebiam, e como em redor não havia comida, seguiam viagem para o sul. O sol chupava os poços e aquelas excomungadas levavam o resto da água, queriam matar o gado. Here's the second quote, again from Quiroga. La sequía continuaba, entretanto. El monte quedó poco a poco desierto, pues los animales se concentraban. Is that the right quote? Yeah. Se concentraban en los ríos de agua que habían sido grandes arroyos. Los tres perros forzaban la distancia que los separaba del abrevadero de las bestias con éxito mediano, pues siendo aquel muy frecuentado a su vez por los jaguareteí, la casa menor tornábase desconfiada. What I find interesting here is how in both these stories of drought, what emerges is an extreme proximity, an extreme and dangerous proximity of different lives that are forced to renegotiate, so to speak, their relations. And what is so interesting is that this is reflected or rebounds into a narrative perspective that freely oscillates between species. No? It's, so to speak, a free, indirect speech of the extractive zone that reflects the changing alliances or constellations amongst different lives. Now, here's a fantastic example also from Vidas Secas. Ainda na víspera eram 6 viventes contando com o papagaio. Coitado morrera na areia do rio, onde haviam descansado à beira de uma poça. A fome apertara demais os retirantes e por ali não existia sinal de comida. Baleia jantara os pés, a cabeça e os ossos do amigo e não guardava lembrança disso. Agora, enquanto parava, dirigia as pupilas brilhantes aos objetos familiares, estranhava não ver sobre o baú de folha a gaiola pequena, onde a ave se equilibrava mal. Fabiano também às vezes sentia falta dela, mas logo a recordação chegava. So here we have the perspective of the dog not remembering how she ate the parrot, and then suddenly, no, it's the human. So the narratives of this biocontact zone tell stories from a trans-species point of view of the emergence of a post-natural world. So what I kind of wanted to suggest is that this is the narrative regime proper to this new geological age, to the Anthropocene, no? In which humans exist as a geological force, as Chakrabarti writes. This formation and dissolution of alliances which include food chains, bacteriological and molecular reactions, but also what the anthropologist Eduardo Korn calls intersymbiotic regimes, no? Or ecologies of living thoughts, he says, which manifest themselves precisely in this oscillation of viewpoints. This world is governed by the dynamics of scarcity, of contamination and contagion. No? It's a biozone of contact, but also one of residues and afterlives. Here's another example from a story with which I'm going to try to conclude and wrap this together. Jaguai. I think I'm not going to read the quotes in Spanish to gain a little bit of time, which is one of the first stories in which Quiroga experiments with this free and direct speech of the extractive zone, just as Graciliano Ramos does in Vidas Secas, which is an almost contemporary text. And what I find so interesting is that the narrative nucleus of both stories is again very similar. They're both stories of drought, and they're both stories of the revocation or rupture of a particular kind of alliance between the human and the dog in the moment that the dog is suspected of having let him or herself become sort of contaminated, no? With the wildlife, the communitas of the forest, no? The very communitas against which the dog was supposed to guard as part of the immunitary alliance. This is a quote from Graciliano, no? Where we're at the moment, this is the beginning of the chapter where the dog is eventually killed by its owner, who suspects her of suffering from rabies, and in order for her not to bite the children, to contaminate the children, he decides to kill the dog. What's interesting, I'm just glossing over this, is that for Fabiano, for the sertanejo, this is indeed an ethical and moral dilemma, unlike, no, say, for the scientists in Drama en la Selva, the first story by Quiroga, where killing the pests is not something that is even discussed. Now here the dog that is infected by, or maybe, no, there's a whole deliberation that is ethical at the same time as it is
bacteriological, so to say. And I think this is because, obviously, Fabiano, as this, again, this native character who is part of the extractive machine that destroys his living environment, but at the same time is much closer to this living environment than the scientists, who are clearly outsiders. Here, what to do becomes a moment of ethical decision and reflection. To conclude, Vidas Secas and Jaguai are but two versions of the same story, one that's different from the returns of Anaconda. All of these are tales of extraction, narrative that tell us about the tensions and crises of alliances that represent the trans-species mode of historicity unleashed by the advance of the capitalist frontier. Jaguai, the story of the wildered-out fox terrier who is accidentally killed by his English owner, who confounds him with a perro de los peones, a servant's dog, is perhaps the most consummate of these stories of the biocontact zone. It is, as so much of Quiroga's frontier stories, a narrative of the failure of the immunitary alliance. For in lending his dog to the peon, Fragoso, Cooper, the Englishman, had actually attempted to submit Jaguai to a process of immunization, exposing him to the wildlife of the servant's dogs in order to strengthen his resistance. The experiment, however, is only partially successful when Fragoso's orchard is invaded by rats, which only Jaguai, in contrast with the fearful attitude of the hunting dogs of the forest, helps to extirpate. So just as he has reaffirmed his place in the immunitary alliance as an exterminator of pests, Jaguai, the fox terrier, is himself accidentally eliminated for having been confused with a plague, with the perros famélicos, the famished dogs that steal chickens. Here, together with the almost imperceptible displacement, again, of the point of view from the dogs to the Englishman, this confusion of modes of dogness, perros de los peones, servants' dogs, also confounds the species history and the history of capital. That is, it associates the division between nature and culture, between lives to cultivate and lives to extirpate, with class struggle. So Jaguai's and also Balea's life in Vidas Secas becomes, so to speak, a life of the threshold, a life that lacks a proper place, having been abandoned by subsequent alliances and becoming even the element that disintegrates or destroys immunitary alliances, but an element that is also unable to re-enter the communitary pact, de los elementos nativos del trópico that we have seen in El Regreso de Anaconda. What I want to suggest a little bit is that this stray dog, a carrier of contagious diseases, which are the effect of natural catastrophe, of the biocontact zone, the extractive zone, that this dog is a kind of post-natural hero that emerges in these texts and is or could be read as the bearer of a radical negativity. As such, it is also the potentiality of a radical, insurgent and contagious politics, which is neither the politics of native comunitas, as in El Regreso de Anaconda, nor that of the immunitary alliance of Un Drama en la Selva. A politics of the Anthropocene, a politics of the extractive zone, which these narratives of drought still only catch a glimpse of, but that will develop into a whole body of literature in Latin American modern regionalism. Thank you very much. I'm sorry for
We have a little bit of time left.
annoying about the politics of immunity is that he's dependent so much on the metaphor of immunity, and yet he speaks about it as if it's a materiality. So I'm wondering what that does to your argument, whether it serves it or not, because I'm thinking here also of the fact that right now in Pennsylvania we have a very small fish that in the wake of fracking has gone from being a herbivore to a piscivore.
Yes.
This is a fact, right? This is
Yes.
not a
This is not metaphor.
this is no metaphor. And so I guess every time I see somebody using Esposito, I'm wondering how they're dealing with the fact that he's resting very strongly on the metaphorization of disease, which he never admits, right? And the language doesn't admit of it. And that also brings me to my sort of second question, which is a question around Agamben and the language of biopolitics, because that tends to inherit similar kinds of problems. Not that Agamben is depending upon a metaphor, but Agamben speaks very, very rarely. If you maybe picked up one of the places of the non-human subject. Like I think he's, his politics of, especially the biopolitics around being able to be sacrificed, but not,
Yes.
So I'm just wondering, so I guess just to stop talking and just say, if you could talk to me a little bit about how the metaphoricity of Esposito affects your work, and secondly, whether you find the biopolitics as elaborated by Agamben adequate to your fictional sources.
I think the simple answer would be this. I'm completely conscious that I'm making a very opportunistic use, as you said. Some of these quotes are picked precisely because they are, at least in Homo Saga, where this quote was from, probably in the open you could discuss whether, but I think I would go along with you that this is still a very metaphorical argument.
Yeah.
I think regarding immunitas and immunization, it's opportunistic here because these are obviously stories that are literally about immunity and immunization, because they're talking about snake poison all the time. No? But also in the much wider sense that this rebellion of the forces of the forest, in a sense, reverse the game and see the human, including the domestic animals, somehow infectious presences. So in the discourse of the stories, immunity, immunization, and contagion are not metaphors at all, or they function as concepts at the same time as they are materially present there as forms of interspecies relation. No? They are semiotic at the same time as they are material.
And the only thing I would throw back at you is just that when one looks at the history or post-colonial history of disease, one wonders what the exotic tropic does to the kind of argument that you're making.
The exotic?
What I call, sorry, I'm just writing about this, but the exotic tropic, the notion that, in other words, we who have lived in the tropics understand that you live with a certain kind of level of risk. For example, if you live in a malaria zone, you can't take, like biologically, you cannot take Malarone for the rest of your life, you'll screw your liver. So there's certain elements of living with disease instead of living with disease as catastrophe.
Yes.
That I just wanted to see you argue out, because that wasn't really part of your...
Yes and no, because clearly the kinds of diseases that befall humans and animals alike are very much not normal in the sense that they occur in contexts of drought that are not just the periodic cycles of...
But animals are reservoirs for human diseases.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's normal. I mean, that's common.
No, that is completely normal, but that's why I was so interested at these descriptions of the proximity of different species of animals around the water sources, which is dangerous and necessary at the same time
And happens all the time in sub-Saharan Africa.
Well, yes, of course, but that doesn't rule out that deforestation and extractive use of, let's call it, areas of high biodiversity lead to situations that in themselves, I mean, you could press the point and say, okay, the planet doesn't care if this or that species becomes extinct or not. At some point, everything is normal or abnormal. But
Or
here,
arguments not curing, but I understand.
no, you see where this goes.
Yes.
What I'm interested in is that there is, and I really, that's why I don't want to use the term exception in the way that Gamben, no, state of exception. But clearly there is this moment of emergencia, which at the same time is one of an exceptional situation and of the emergence of new constellations of interspecies relationships that are both material and semiotic. And I just find it interesting that in these texts from the 1920s and 30s, you already have a very clear, including on the register of the formal organization of narrative consciousness, call it something,
No, that's
of
very
what is
exciting.
going on.
Thank you, that helps a lot.
No, thanks for the question.
I think I have time for one more question, Victoria.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. And I would just, pose a very brief question, and it's more like a clarification rather than a question regarding the term alternative biopolitics you mentioned, and and the resistance of biopolitics through an alliance of the living, right? And I understand this proximity between the non-human and the human. The texts are very, very interesting. But I was wondering what is the position or the conceptualization of the term alternative, right? And like what
Alternative to what?
alternative biopolitics.
Uh-huh.
What?
Well, alternative to a notion of biopolitics that, in perhaps a banalization of Foucault, reads it as something that is, if you like, bringing ever wider quantities of living forms under the control of human agency, or obviously that is sort of the taking hold of lo viviente, of the living, is a form of biopolitics. But what I find interesting, and here for me at least, although I have issues with it, Eduardo Con's book How Forests Think was useful for me in the way that it thinks of the semiotic relations between different species that are not symbolic but still semiotic. And if they are semiotic, then there's also obviously a politicity to these constellations. So I think it works on these two levels, that I think the return of Anaconda by Quiroga talks about or envisages a politics of an alliance of forces that are not human in their majority. And the text clearly, this sort of call to arms, is not a political statement. And I think we're at a moment where we can actually read this in a non-allegorical fashion, different from the way that the story has been read during most of the 20th century. In that sense, alternative.
Thank you so much.